What if I told you that every thought you've ever had still exists somewhere? Not in your memory, not in the folds of your brain, but in a place beyond the fabric of our reality. Every decision, every whispered secret, every moment of triumph and despair, recorded in an archive that transcends time and space itself. What if the entirety of human history, including the chapters we believe are lost forever, exists in a cosmic library that certain individuals claim they can access? This is the promise of the Akashic Records, a concept that has haunted mystics, philosophers, and seekers of forbidden knowledge for thousands of years. According to those who believe, these records form an ethereal repository of all human experience, a dimensional archive where the past, present, and future collapse into a single, accessible point. Imagine a library without walls, without books, without physical form, yet containing more information than every library on Earth combined. A place where the memories of vanished civilizations wait in silence, where the thoughts of people dead for millennia still echo, where the future unfolds like a scroll that has already been written. But here's where the mystery deepens into something far more unsettling. Throughout history, certain individuals have claimed not just to believe in these records, but to have actually accessed them. Prophets who predicted events with impossible accuracy. Psychics who described lost empires in precise detail, only to have archaeologists later confirm their visions. Mystics who returned from their journeys with knowledge they could not possibly possess through conventional means. And yet, those who claim to have touched this cosmic archive often speak of it with a trembling voice. They warn that some knowledge comes with a terrible cost. They suggest that certain memories were meant to remain forgotten, certain truths buried for good reason. They hint at a disturbing possibility that haunts everyone who pursues this mystery. What if we're not supposed to remember? What if the veil between us and total knowledge exists as a protection rather than a barrier? The accounts that follow will take you into the shadows of this possibility. You'll encounter the documented cases that defenders cannot easily dismiss, the predictions that came true, the secrets revealed, and perhaps most troubling of all, the pattern of tragedy that seems to follow those who claim to have glimpsed what lies in that otherworldly archive. In the quiet town of Hopkinsville, Kentucky, in the early hours of a spring morning in 1944, a secretary named Gladys Davis sat beside a man lying perfectly still on a worn leather couch. The man's eyes were closed, his breathing slow and rhythmic, and his hands were folded across his chest as if he were already dead. Then, after several minutes of unsettling silence, his voice emerged, but it was not quite his own. The tone was different, the cadence strange, the vocabulary far beyond what this man, with only an 8th grade education, should possess. Edgar Cayce had entered the trance state that would make him one of the most documented psychics in American history. And what came from his mouth during these sessions would challenge everything we think we know about human consciousness and the ancient world. Edgar Cayce was born on a tobacco farm near Hopkinsville in 1877. He grew up as an ordinary country boy with deeply religious parents and showed no particular signs of the abilities that would later define his life. But at the age of 23, Cayce lost his voice completely. Doctors could find no physical cause for his condition, and he spent months communicating only in strained whispers. In desperation, a local hypnotist named Al Lane put Cayce into a trance to see if the condition could be addressed through suggestion. What happened next changed everything. While unconscious, Cayce began to speak in a clear, strong voice, diagnosing his own condition in precise medical terminology and prescribing a specific treatment. When he woke, he had no memory of what he had said, but when the treatment was applied, his voice returned within days. Word spread quickly through the small communities of Kentucky. If Cayce could diagnose himself while asleep, could he do the same for others? The answer apparently was yes. People began arriving at his door with illnesses that had baffled their doctors. Cayce would lie down on his couch, loosen his tie and belt, fold his hands across his solar plexus, and within minutes, slip into his trance. Gladys Davis would sit beside him with her stenographer's notebook, recording every word that emerged from his lips. These sessions became known as readings, and over the course of 43 years, Cayce would give more than 14,000 of them, each one meticulously documented. The medical readings were remarkable enough. Witnesses described how Cayce, a man with no formal education beyond grammar school, would accurately describe complex physiological conditions, prescribe specific compounds and treatments, and demonstrate knowledge of human anatomy that seemed impossible for someone of his background. Dr. Wesley Ketchum, a respected physician, investigated Cayce's abilities and reported his findings to a clinical research society in 1910. The accuracy rate was astonishing. Patients who had exhausted conventional medicine found relief through the treatments Cayce prescribed while unconscious. But Cayce himself remained humble and somewhat disturbed by his gift. He had no idea where the information came from, and he had no memory of anything he said during the trances. Then in 1923, something changed. A man named Arthur Lammers came to Cayce seeking not medical advice, but answers about the nature of existence itself. During this reading, Cayce's sleeping voice began to speak of things that had never emerged before. He spoke of past lives, of reincarnation, of the soul's journey through multiple incarnation. For Cayce, a devout Christian, this was deeply troubling. Reincarnation was not part of his faith tradition, and he seriously considered ending the readings altogether. But Lammers convinced him to continue, and what followed was a series of trance sessions that would introduce concepts far stranger than herbal remedies and spinal adjustments. Cayce began to speak of Atlantis, not the mythical island mentioned briefly by Plato, but a vast, technologically advanced civilization that existed for thousands of years before vanishing beneath the waves. The details were disturbingly specific. According to the sleeping Cayce, Atlantis was not primitive, but highly sophisticated, possessing technologies that in some ways exceeded our own. At the heart of their civilization was something Cayce called the Great Crystal, or the Terrible Crystal, depending on the reading. This massive crystalline structure, sometimes referred to as the Taoist stone, was used to harness energy from the sun, the stars, and from the earth itself. The Atlanteans had learned to focus and amplify this energy to power their cities, their vehicles, and eventually their weapons. The readings described crystal technology in elaborate detail. Smaller crystals were tuned to specific frequencies and used for healing, communication, and even transportation. Buildings were constructed using sound and vibration to levitate massive stones. Aircraft that did not require wings moved silently through the skies. But the most disturbing elements of Cayce's Atlantean readings dealt with what he called the things, genetic experiments conducted by Atlantean scientists who had lost their moral compass. According to these trance sessions, the Atlanteans began to manipulate the genetics of humans and animals, creating hybrid creatures for labor and entertainment. These beings were described as having diminished mental capacity, designed to be slaves. The ethical violations were profound, and according to Cayce, this hubris contributed directly to Atlantis' destruction. The fall of Atlantis, as described by the sleeping prophet, did not happen all at once. Cayce spoke of 3 distinct periods of destruction. The first occurred around 50,000 BC, when misuse of the crystal technology caused massive earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that broke apart the continent. The second destruction happened in 15,600 BC, when further geological catastrophes split the remaining landmass into islands. The final destruction came in 10,714 BC, when the last remnants of Atlantis sank beneath the Atlantic Ocean in a single day and night of unprecedented cataclysm. Fire mountains erupted, the earth split open, and millions perished as the ocean swallowed an entire civilization. But here's where Cayce's readings take their most chilling turn. The sleeping prophet insisted that before the final destruction, the Atlantean priests, the spiritual leaders who had opposed the misuse of technology, gathered their most important records and transported them to 3 separate locations for safekeeping. One set of records was taken to Egypt, where they were supposedly sealed in a hidden chamber beneath the Sphinx. Another set was transported to the Yucatan Peninsula, in what is now Mexico. The third was preserved in Atlantis itself, in a temple that would eventually sink but somehow remain intact beneath the waves near the area, now known as Bimini. These records, according to Cayce, contain the complete history of Atlantis, including detailed descriptions of their technologies, their spiritual practices, and the mistakes that led to their annihilation. More disturbing still, Cayce predicted that these records would be discovered. He specified that the chamber near the Sphinx would be found at the end of the 20th century, coinciding with geological changes that would raise portions of Atlantis from the sea floor. The predictions were specific enough to be testable. In several readings from the 1930s, Cayce stated that in 1968 or 1969, portions of Atlantis would begin to appear near Bimini Daitar. In 1968, divers near Bimini discovered what appeared to be a road or wall constructed of massive rectangular stones, arranged in precise geometric patterns beneath the shallow waters. The formation became known as the Bimini Road, and while mainstream archaeologists remain skeptical, attributing it to natural geological processes, believers in Cayce's readings point to it as validation of his predictions. Whether natural or artificial, the timing of the discovery, just as Cayce had specified decades earlier, is undeniably unsettling. Those who witnessed Cayce's trance states described them as deeply unnerving experiences. His son, Hugh Lynn Cayce, recalled watching his father's face change during readings, the muscles relaxing into an expression that seemed almost death-like. Sometimes Cayce would speak in his own voice, but often the voice changed entirely, becoming deeper, more authoritative, speaking in antiquated phrasing. Gladys Davis, who attended more than 9,000 readings over her career as Cayce's secretary, noted that he never made a mistake or corrected himself while in trance. The information flowed continuously, perfectly structured, as if being read from an invisible text. Cayce himself claimed that while in trance, he was accessing what he called the Akashic Records, a concept borrowed from Theosophy that describes a cosmic library containing every thought, action, and event that has ever occurred. According to this framework, every soul's journey through all incarnations is recorded in this metaphysical archive, accessible to those who know how to reach it. Cayce apparently reached it every time he closed his eyes and entered his peculiar sleeping state. The medical readings provided some of the most compelling evidence for the reality of whatever Cayce was accessing. Dr. Gina Sermonara documented numerous cases in her book Many Mansions, describing instances where Cayce correctly diagnosed conditions that were later verified by medical testing. In one case, he described a woman's condition as resulting from a fall she had experienced as a child, an event the woman did not remember until she asked her mother, who confirmed that yes, she had fallen from a carriage at age 4. Cayce prescribed unusual treatments, combinations of herbs and compounds that seemed random but consistently produced results. Skeptics argue that success stories are remembered while failures are forgotten, but the sheer volume of documented cases makes dismissal difficult. Yet it is the reincarnation readings, and specifically those dealing with Atlantis, that remain most controversial and disturbing. Cayce conducted hundreds of life readings, tracing individuals' past incarnations through various civilizations. A striking number of these readings identified the person as having lived during one of the 3 periods of Atlantis. More unsettling, Cayce warned that many souls who had been incarnate during Atlantis's final days were reincarnating in the 20th century, particularly those who had been involved in the misuse of technology. In reading after reading, the sleeping Cayce identified individuals as former Atlantean scientists, priests, or technologists who had either contributed to the destruction or tried to prevent it. According to these readings, these souls were returning now, in this era, because humanity was once again reaching a technological threshold similar to Atlantis's final period. The implication was clear and chilling. The same souls who had destroyed an entire civilization through technological hubris were back, and they carried within their unconscious minds the same tendencies, the same brilliance, and potentially the same fatal flaws. Cayce warned that if humanity did not learn from Atlantis's mistakes, we were destined to repeat them. The misuse of atomic energy particularly concerned him. In readings conducted during the 1930s and 1940s, before nuclear weapons were publicly known, Cayce spoke of humanity rediscovering forces similar to those that had destroyed Atlantis. He warned that these forces, when used without spiritual wisdom, would lead to catastrophe. The prediction about the hidden records carries its own implicit warning. If these records are discovered, and if they contain the technological knowledge Cayce described, humanity will face a choice. Will we use advanced knowledge wisely, or will we repeat the pattern of destruction? Cayce suggested that the records would only be accessible when humanity had reached a level of spiritual development sufficient to handle them responsibly. Whether that condition has been met remains an open question. Edgar Cayce died in 1945, exhausted from giving readings to families desperate for news of loved ones during World War II. On his deathbed, he gave no final dramatic pronouncements. He simply faded away, crossing into death as gently as he had crossed into trance thousands of times before. But the legacy of his readings remains, preserved in the archives of the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, available for anyone to study. The question that haunts those who examine Cayce's work is simple, but profound. If he was merely fantasizing or confabulating, how did he produce medical diagnoses of such consistent accuracy? How did he predict geological discoveries decades in advance? And if he was truly accessing some source of hidden knowledge, what does that suggest about the nature of consciousness and the possibility that history contains chapters far stranger than we have imagined? The sleeping prophet spoke of a drowned civilization, advanced beyond our understanding, destroyed by its own power. He warned that its children have returned, carrying within them the memory of fire and flood. Whether prophecy or delusion, the message remains the same. We have been here before, and we did not survive. The records lie hidden, waiting to reveal whether we have learned enough to deserve them. In the autumn of 1875, in a cramped apartment on Irving Place in New York City, a Russian woman with piercing blue eyes sat before a gathering of curious seekers and made a claim that would forever alter Western spirituality. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a chain-smoking mystic with a mysterious past, announced that she had discovered the keys to a cosmic library where every thought, word, and deed throughout all of human history was recorded in a substance beyond matter itself. She called these the Akashic Records, borrowing from Sanskrit terminology, though what she described bore little resemblance to any Eastern philosophy that had come before. This was not simply another spiritualist parlor trick of the kind that saturated Victorian society. Blavatsky claimed she had been trained by hidden masters dwelling in the mountains of Tibet, beings of almost godlike wisdom who had selected her as their messenger to a spiritually starving Western world. She insisted she could project her consciousness beyond the physical realm and read from these imperishable records at will, accessing knowledge that had driven lesser minds into permanent insanity. The Theosophical Society that Blavatsky founded alongside Colonel Henry Steele Olcott became the primary vehicle through which these ideas flooded into Western consciousness. Unlike the gentle spiritualism that had captivated parlor rooms across America and Europe, Theosophy carried with it an unsettling darkness. Blavatsky wrote extensively of secret brotherhoods that guarded ancient wisdom with ruthless dedication, of dimensional barriers that separated human consciousness from realms of terrible beauty and power, and of spiritual hierarchies that stretched from the lowest human to entities so evolved they bore no resemblance to anything we might recognize as alive. According to her voluminous writings, particularly in The Secret Doctrine published in 1888, accessing the Akashic Records was not a passive experience of reading dusty tomes in some celestial library. It required the aspirant to project their consciousness through multiple planes of existence, each more dangerous than the last, each populated by entities and forces that could shred an unprepared mind like tissue paper. Blavatsky's description of how she accessed these records reads like a manual for controlled madness. She claimed to enter trance states that lasted for hours, during which her consciousness would separate from her physical body and ascend through what she called the astral plane, the mental plane, and finally into the Akashic plane itself. Witnesses to these trances described her body becoming rigid, her breathing nearly stopping, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. She would emerge from these states exhausted, sometimes bleeding from the nose, speaking in languages she claimed not to know, filling page after page with automatic writing in scripts that scholars could not identify. Her closest followers viewed these episodes with a mixture of awe and terror. They understood they were witnessing something that pushed the boundaries of human capability, but they could never quite shake the feeling that Madame Blavatsky was opening doors that perhaps should have remained closed. The masters who supposedly taught Blavatsky these techniques remained conveniently invisible to her followers, communicating through letters that would mysteriously appear in locked rooms and sealed boxes. These Mahatmas, as she called them, particularly the figures she named Moria and Kutumi, represented something more sinister than simple spiritual guides. They were gatekeepers to knowledge that transformed those who possessed it. knowledge that came with terrible responsibilities and dangers. Blavatsky warned repeatedly that attempting to access the Akashic Records without proper preparation and guidance from these hidden masters would result in catastrophe. The unprepared student might successfully project their consciousness beyond the physical only to become lost in the astral realm. Their body left behind like an abandoned house, while their spirit wandered dimensions it could neither understand nor escape. Or worse, they might attract the attention of entities that fed on human consciousness, thought forms and elementals that could follow them back to the physical world and torment them into madness or death. Within Blavatsky's cosmology, the Akashic Records contained not just the history of humanity, but the blueprint of cosmic evolution itself. She wrote of root races that had risen and fallen across millions of years, entire civilizations on continents now submerged beneath the oceans. The Lemurians and Atlanteans featured prominently in her descriptions, not as mythological concepts, but as historical realities preserved in Akashic memory. These ancient races had possessed technology and spiritual powers that made modern humanity look like children playing with toys. They had mastered the manipulation of matter through thought, had created living beings through force of will, had built cities that floated in the air and tunneled through the earth's crust. And they had destroyed themselves utterly, leaving only fragments of their knowledge in the hands of secret brotherhoods that passed this dangerous wisdom down through the ages with extreme caution. According to Blavatsky, attempting to access records of these lost civilizations without proper initiation was particularly hazardous because the very information itself carried a kind of psychic charge, an energetic imprint of the catastrophes that had destroyed these people. The darker implications of Theosophical doctrine became apparent in the experiences of students who took Blavatsky's teachings too literally and attempted to access the records themselves. Historical records from the Theosophical Society's archives, though carefully sanitized in official publications, contain disturbing references to members who suffered complete mental breakdowns after attempting astral projection and Akashic access. One account from 1882 describes a dedicated student in London, a former physician named William Ashton, who locked himself in his study for 3 days attempting to reach the records through meditation and fasting techniques Blavatsky had outlined in private teachings. When his landlady finally broke down the door, she found him crouched in a corner, his fingernails bloodied from scratching strange symbols into the wooden floor, speaking in rapid bursts about the burning towers of Atlantis and the terrible knowledge that had destroyed them. Ashton never recovered. He spent the remaining 7 years of his life in an asylum, insisting that something had followed him back from the Akashic plane, something that whispered to him constantly about the approaching end of the current root race. Another case from 1886 involved a wealthy American woman named Margaret Hollis, who traveled to India seeking the hidden masters Blavatsky claimed to have studied with. Hollis became convinced that she could access the Akashic Records through a combination of hashish consumption and prolonged meditation in complete darkness. According to letters she wrote to fellow Theosophists before her final experiment, she believed the records existed in a dimension accessible through what she called frequency attunement, a state where the vibration of individual consciousness matched the vibration of the cosmic memory. Her servants found her after 5 days sealed in a lightless room, her hands covered in burns from candles she had apparently held until the flames reached her flesh without seeming to notice. She was catatonic for weeks, and when she finally regained the ability to speak, she claimed she had succeeded in reaching the records but had witnessed the entire future history of the human race, including its extinction. The knowledge, she said, was not meant for human minds to contain. She took her own life 3 months later. These were not isolated incidents. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, as Theosophy spread across Europe and America, a pattern emerged of devoted students pushing too far, too fast into practices that Blavatsky had described but never fully explained. The Society's inner circle began to suspect that Blavatsky herself might have been a victim of the very forces she claimed to command. Her health deteriorated dramatically during the writing of the secret doctrine. She suffered from what she called astral attacks, periods where she claimed hostile entities from other planes attempted to possess her or drive her insane. Whether these were genuine metaphysical assaults or the psychological breakdown of a woman who had immersed herself too deeply in her own mythology, the effect on her followers was profound. They witnessed their teacher, the woman who claimed to have mastered these dimensional barriers, struggling against forces she could barely describe. Blavatsky taught that the Akashic Records were guarded by what she called the Lords of Karma, beings of immense power who determined which souls had earned the right to access this knowledge. These were not benevolent librarians, but cosmic judges who tested every aspirant with visions designed to break weak minds and turn back those deemed unworthy. She described trials where the seeker would be confronted with every terrible act they had committed across all their incarnations, forced to experience the suffering they had caused from the perspective of their victims. She spoke of illusions so convincing that students might believe they had spent years or centuries in hellish realms when only moments had passed in physical time. The purpose of these trials, she claimed, was to ensure that those who finally reached the records had been stripped of ego, ambition, and the desire for personal power. Only then could they be trusted with knowledge that could literally reshape reality. The question that haunted critics of theosophy then, and continues to disturb researchers now, is whether Blavatsky genuinely believed in what she taught, or whether she was a masterful fraud who accidentally created a belief system so powerful it could induce genuine psychotic breaks in susceptible followers. The evidence suggests something more complicated and more disturbing than either simple faith or simple deception. Blavatsky demonstrated knowledge of Eastern philosophy and occult traditions that seemed impossible for a woman of her time and background to have acquired through normal means. She produced written materials at a speed that seemed superhuman, sometimes writing on multiple complex topics simultaneously with what observers described as a kind of fevered certainty. Yet many of the specific claims she made about the hidden masters and her time in Tibet have been proven false, or at least highly exaggerated. What remains is the uncomfortable possibility that Blavatsky had indeed accessed something, some layer of consciousness, or perhaps collective human memory, but had interpreted it through the lens of her own imagination and the occult traditions she had studied, creating a hybrid system that was part genuine mystical experience and part elaborate construction. The legacy of Blavatsky's introduction of the Akashic Records to the West extends far beyond the Theosophical Society itself. Her ideas seeded countless other movements, from anthroposophy to the New Age, each carrying forward the notion that somewhere beyond the physical world exists a record of all things, accessible to those brave or foolish enough to seek it. What often gets lost, in the more sanitized modern versions, is the darkness that permeated Blavatsky's original vision. This was not gentle spirituality about finding your higher self or accessing past lives for personal growth. This was cosmic horror dressed in the language of enlightenment, a system that promised ultimate knowledge while warning that the price of that knowledge might be your sanity or your soul. The students who followed Blavatsky's path too literally learned that some barriers exist for reasons, and that the human mind, for all its potential, might not be designed to contain the weight of cosmic memory. Their breakdowns and deaths served as warnings that the Theosophical Society never quite acknowledged, preferring to focus on the promise of spiritual evolution rather than the casualties of the journey. In the end, Blavatsky's greatest and darkest legacy might be the idea she planted in Western consciousness that we are separated from infinite knowledge only by thin veils, and that with the right techniques, the right preparation, anyone might tear through those veils and glimpse what lies beyond, regardless of whether they can survive what they find there. In the summer of 1973, a physicist named Harold Puthoff sat across from a man who would change everything the Central Intelligence Agency thought they knew about the limits of human consciousness. The man's name was Ingo Swann, and he had just done something that shouldn't have been possible. He had described, in precise detail, the interior of a building he had never seen, located hundreds of miles away. But that was just the beginning. What Swann and others would eventually access during their remote viewing sessions for the government would prove far more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. The program that would eventually become known as Stargate began in the paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, when intelligence agencies were desperate for any advantage over the Soviet Union. Reports had reached the CIA that the Soviets were pouring millions of rubles into psychic research, attempting to create a new form of espionage that could penetrate any barrier, any security system, any classified facility. If consciousness itself could travel beyond the body, then nowhere would be safe. No vault could protect secrets. No distance could ensure security. The implications were terrifying, and the United States couldn't afford to fall behind. What started as a defensive measure, a way to understand what the Soviets might be capable of, quickly evolved into something far stranger. The Stanford Research Institute in California became ground zero for experiments that blurred the line between hard science and the paranormal. Puthoff and his colleague Russell Targ began testing individuals who claimed to have psychic abilities, searching for any genuine signal amid the noise of charlatans and self-delusion. They developed rigorous protocols, double-blind testing procedures, statistical analyses. They were determined to approach the impossible with scientific rigor. And then they found people who could actually do it. Not all the time, not with perfect accuracy, but with a consistency that defied random chance. Remote viewers, as they came to be called, could describe distant locations they had never visited. They could sketch buildings, identify objects, relay information that they had no conventional means of knowing. Pat Price, a former police commissioner, demonstrated an almost frightening level of accuracy. Ingo Swann developed techniques that others could be trained to replicate. The program expanded, drawing more viewers, more funding, more attention from the highest levels of government. But it was Swann's Jupiter session that changed everything. In April of 1973, before the Voyager probes had even launched, Swann was asked to remote view the planet Jupiter. What happened during that session would haunt researchers for decades. Swann sat in a sealed room, given nothing but the coordinates and the target. He entered the state of consciousness he had learned to access, that strange twilight zone between waking and dreaming, where information seemed to flow from impossible sources. And then he began to describe things that made no sense. He reported a ring around Jupiter. This was years before any probe had discovered Jupiter's faint ring system. Scientists at the time were certain that only Saturn had rings. Swann's claim seemed like an obvious error, proof that remote viewing was nothing but imagination and guesswork. But Swann insisted on what he had perceived. He described the ring's structure, its composition. He also reported something even stranger, something that didn't fit with any understanding of the gas giant. He claimed to perceive mountains, crystalline structures rising from what should have been an atmosphere of hydrogen and helium. The scientists running the session assumed Swann had simply failed this time. Remote viewing wasn't perfect after all. Perhaps he had confused Jupiter with another target, or perhaps his imagination had filled in details where perception failed. They filed the report away and continued with other experiments. Then, years later, when Voyager 1 made its historic flyby of Jupiter in 1979, it sent back images that stunned the scientific community. Jupiter did have a ring. Faint, difficult to detect, but absolutely real. Swann had been right about something he had no possible way of knowing. But what about the mountains, the crystalline structures he had described? Those didn't appear in the Voyager images. Scientists dismissed them as the one element where Swann's perception had failed. Except Swann himself had a different interpretation, one that was far more unsettling. In his later writings and private conversations, he suggested that he hadn't been viewing Jupiter itself during that session. Instead, he believed he had inadvertently accessed what he called a cosmic database, a repository of information that existed beyond normal space and time. The Jupiter he described, he claimed, wasn't the current Jupiter. It was Jupiter from a different era, perhaps millions of years in the past or future. Or perhaps it was information about Jupiter from a reality adjacent to our own. This cosmic database, Swann came to believe, was what remote viewers were actually accessing during their sessions. It wasn't that their consciousness was traveling to distant locations in any conventional sense. Instead, they were tapping into a field of information that contained data about everything that had ever happened, was happening, or would happen. He was describing, whether he fully realized it or not, something that mystics and esoteric traditions had spoken about for thousands of years. The Akashic Records, the Universal Library, the Mind of God. Other remote viewers began reporting similar experiences. They described moments during sessions where they seemed to access vast repositories of knowledge, where information flooded in faster than they could process it. Some reported encountering what felt like an organizing intelligence within this database, something that curated or controlled access to information. The experience was often described as overwhelming, even terrifying. It felt less like discovering a tool and more like touching something alive, something aware of being observed. Pat Price's experiences took an even darker turn. Price, who had proven to be one of the most naturally gifted remote viewers in the program, began to focus on targets that hadn't been assigned to him. He became obsessed with what he claimed were extraterrestrial installations, both off-world and hidden on Earth. In sessions that were supposed to focus on Soviet facilities or military installations, Price would sometimes deviate, his consciousness apparently drawn to targets of his own choosing. He described structures on the Moon and Mars. He reported underground bases in remote locations on Earth, facilities that he claimed were not built by human hands. The details Price provided were specific and disturbing. He described technology that seemed biological rather than mechanical. He reported beings that didn't match any known life form. Most unsettling of all, he claimed that some of these installations were ancient, far older than human civilization, and he insisted that the cosmic database he accessed during remote viewing contained information suggesting these sites were connected to humanity's origins in ways that contradicted every accepted historical narrative. Price's handlers grew concerned. His reports were becoming increasingly difficult to categorize. Were these genuine perceptions of something real, or was Price's mind creating elaborate fantasies? The line between signal and noise was blurring. Some researchers worried that prolonged remote viewing was causing psychological damage, that accessing this cosmic database was affecting the viewer's grip on consensus reality. Price himself seemed changed by what he had perceived. Colleagues noted that he became more withdrawn, more anxious. He spoke about information he had accessed that he refused to put in official reports, claiming it was too dangerous, too destabilizing. In July of 1975, Pat Price died suddenly in Las Vegas. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack. He was only 57 years old, but the circumstances surrounding his death immediately triggered suspicion among those who knew him. Price had been in good health. He had no history of heart problems, and the timing seemed impossibly convenient, coming just weeks after he had submitted reports about his remote viewing of alleged extraterrestrial installations. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately. Some claimed that Price had been murdered, that his access to forbidden information had made him a liability. But to whom? If hostile foreign powers wanted to silence remote viewers, why target Price specifically? Others suggested something even more disturbing. What if Price's death wasn't murder in the conventional sense? What if accessing certain information in the cosmic database came with consequences? What if there were safeguards, defenses against those who probed too deep into forbidden knowledge? The researchers who worked with Price found themselves facing questions that science had no framework to address. If remote viewing genuinely allowed access to a universal database of information, who or what maintained that database? Were there rules governing access? Could perceiving certain information trigger responses, protective mechanisms designed to prevent knowledge from spreading? The idea seemed like paranoid fantasy, but Price's death couldn't be easily dismissed as coincidence. Other remote viewers in the program began experiencing unusual health problems. Some reported vivid nightmares after sessions focusing on certain targets. Others described feeling watched, as if accessing the cosmic database had drawn unwanted attention from something beyond normal perception. The psychological toll of the work became increasingly apparent. These weren't just intelligence gatherers looking at distant military bases. They were explorers venturing into realms of consciousness that human beings might not be equipped to navigate safely. Despite these concerns, the program continued for years. The CIA and later the Defense Intelligence Agency used remote viewers for hundreds of operations. Some of the intelligence gathered proved valuable. Viewers located hostages, described weapons facilities, provided information that was later confirmed through conventional means. But the most interesting sessions, the ones that hinted at deeper mysteries, were often classified at levels beyond the standard top-secret designation. Information about the cosmic database, about anomalous structures on other planets, about the true nature of what remote viewers were accessing, disappeared into compartmentalized programs that few people even knew existed. Then, in 1995, the government suddenly announced that the Stargate program was being shut down. The official explanation was that remote viewing had proven unreliable, that the intelligence gathered wasn't worth the cost of the program. A review conducted by the American Institutes for Research concluded that while some statistically significant results had been achieved, the operational value was limited. The program was terminated, its files declassified, its secrets seemingly laid bare for public scrutiny. But those who had worked in the program knew that the official explanation was incomplete at best. The truly sensitive sessions, the ones dealing with what Swan called the cosmic database, and what Price had died investigating, weren't included in the declassified materials. Entire categories of remote viewing targets were missing from the public record. Researchers who tried to speak openly about the stranger aspects of the program found themselves subject to non-disclosure agreements and legal threats. The message was clear. Some things would remain buried. Why shut down a program that had run successfully for over 20 years? If remote viewing was useless, why had the government invested millions of dollars and countless man-hours into developing it? The timing of the shutdown itself raised questions. 1995 marked a period when interest in UFOs and extraterrestrial phenomena was surging in popular culture. The internet was making it harder to control information. Perhaps the government decided that a limited disclosure, releasing carefully selected files about remote viewing, would satisfy public curiosity while allowing the real secrets to remain hidden. Some former participants have suggested a darker possibility. What if the program wasn't shut down at all? What if it simply went deeper underground, reclassified under new names, hidden within black-budget operations that have no public oversight? The skills that Swan and others developed, the protocols for accessing the cosmic database, those wouldn't simply be abandoned if they genuinely worked. They would be protected, weaponized, used in ways the public would never know about. Ingo Swann himself spent his later years trying to understand what he had touched during those sessions. He wrote extensively about the experience of accessing what he believed was a field of information underlying physical reality. He described it as simultaneously wonderful and terrifying, a realm where human consciousness could perceive truths that violated every assumption about the nature of existence. But he also warned about the dangers. Not everyone who accessed this database came back unchanged. Some viewers lost themselves in the information, becoming unable to distinguish between perceived realities and consensus reality. Others, like Price, may have paid an even higher price for their glimpses beyond the veil. The question that haunts researchers even today is what exactly these remote viewers were accessing. If it was real, if there truly is some kind of universal database containing all information, what are the implications? Does consciousness survive death, recorded eternally in this cosmic library? Are our thoughts, our experiences, our entire lives nothing more than entries in an impossible database maintained by forces we can't comprehend? And if accessing this information comes with risks, if there are guardians or safeguards protecting certain knowledge, what does that suggest about the structure of reality itself? The government's sudden shutdown of public remote viewing research may have been the most telling revelation of all. Perhaps what was discovered was too dangerous to continue, not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. Perhaps Swan and Price and the others had opened a door that was never meant to be opened, accessed information that human beings weren't ready to handle. And perhaps somewhere in classified facilities that officially don't exist, that research continues, pushing deeper into the cosmic database, uncovering secrets that can never be shared with the world that paid for their discovery. The hypnotist's voice was soft, rhythmic, counting backwards from 10 as Sarah Mitchell's breathing slowed and deepened. It was April 2017, in a modest office in Portland, Oregon. Sarah had come seeking relief from chronic nightmares, recurring dreams of drowning that had plagued her since childhood. What emerged during that session would send ripples through a small but devoted community of researchers studying something called the Akashic Records, a cosmic library supposedly containing all human knowledge and experience across time. Under hypnosis, Sarah's voice changed. Her modern American accent smoothed into something different, her vocabulary shifting to include words that seemed archaic, strange. She began describing a city of white stone towers, rising beside an endless sea. The architecture she detailed was precise, technical. She spoke of buildings with copper domes that caught the sunlight, of intricate water systems channeling flow through carved channels in limestone streets, of a great harbor with breakwaters extending far into blue water. But most disturbing to the hypnotherapist recording this session was Sarah's description of a massive library, a structure she claimed stood in Alexandria before the famous ancient library that historians know was destroyed. Sarah described walking through corridors lined with honeycomb niches, each containing scrolls wrapped in linen. She mentioned the smell of cedar oil used to preserve the papyrus, the sound of sandals on polished marble floors, the weight of afternoon light filtering through high windows of thin alabaster. She detailed a cataloging system, explaining how the scrolls were organized by subject and region, marked with small clay tags bearing symbols in multiple languages. Her level of architectural detail was extraordinary for someone who had never studied Egyptology, never traveled to Egypt, and by her own admission barely graduated high school. What made Egyptologists uncomfortable when they later reviewed the session transcript was not just the accuracy of her descriptions, but the things she described that archaeology could not confirm or deny. Sarah spoke of underground chambers beneath the library, levels that descended deep into bedrock, where the most ancient texts were kept in sealed rooms. She mentioned that certain knowledge was restricted, guarded by priests who would only grant access to proven scholars. She described security measures, including locked doors requiring multiple keys held by different custodians, a system that matched no historical record but seemed entirely plausible given what we know of ancient Egyptian bureaucracy, and their obsession with protecting sacred knowledge. But Sarah's session took a darker turn as the hypnotist guided her forward through the memory. Her breathing became rapid, distressed. She described looking up at the sky and seeing it change color, becoming greenish, wrong. She spoke of the ground shaking, of running through streets as buildings collapsed, of a wall of water approaching from the sea, impossibly tall, blocking out the sun. The water came with a sound she described as the earth screaming. Then her memory went dark, and she was gone. Consciousness ended in that ancient drowning. When Sarah emerged from hypnosis, she was crying, but she could not explain why. She retained only fragments of what she had described, fleeting images that felt more like someone else's memories than her own. Sarah Mitchell is not alone. She represents just one case among hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individuals who claim to access the Akashic Records through various means, primarily through hypnotic regression or deep meditative states. The phenomenon has been documented by researchers and therapists since the 1960s, though reports of accessing collective memory or cosmic knowledge stretch back through human history, appearing in mystical traditions across cultures. The second case that demands attention involves Marcus Chen, a software engineer from San Francisco who began practicing transcendental meditation in 2014 to manage work-related stress. Marcus had no interest in mysticism or past lives. He was, by all accounts, a rational skeptic who viewed meditation purely as a neurological exercise. But during a 10-day silent retreat in Northern California in 2016, something unexpected happened during a particularly deep meditative state. Marcus described the experience as falling through layers of his own consciousness, descending through what felt like strata of memory that were not his own. He found himself, or rather found his awareness, standing in what he could only describe as a vast hall filled with light. The space seemed to exist beyond normal geometry, extending in directions his mind struggled to process. Within this space, he perceived presences, entities he called the record keepers, though he insisted they were not beings in any conventional sense, but rather served as organizing principles, living indices to unimaginable amounts of information. What disturbed Marcus most was what happened when he tried to access specific information. He reported feeling drawn to knowledge about a particular time period. What he sensed was approximately 12,000 years ago. The pull was magnetic, overwhelming, as if this period contained answers to questions he had not known he was asking. But as he moved toward this temporal region within the records, he encountered what he described as a boundary, a wall that was not physical but absolute nonetheless. The record keepers, those organizing presences, blocked his access. He felt their attention turn toward him, and with it came a clear communication, wordless but unmistakable. This knowledge was sealed, protected, not ready for access. Marcus emerged from meditation shaking. deeply unsettled. Unlike Sarah, he retained full memory of his experience. What bothered him enough to seek out researchers studying Akashic phenomena was a specific vision he managed to glimpse before being blocked. He saw a civilization of stunning advancement, cities that seemed to blend organic and architectural forms, technology that operated on principles he could not begin to understand. He saw geometric structures, massive in scale, aligned with astronomical precision. And he saw the ending, a catastrophic event that involved the sky itself seeming to tear open. Celestial mechanics gone wrong. The Earth's crust displaced in a matter of hours, oceans rising to swallow continent. But most significant was the warning Marcus felt embedded in the experience. The sense that this has happened before and will happen again. That destruction and renewal operate in cycles spanning thousands of years, that our current civilization exists in the space between catastrophes, and that we are approaching the end of this particular cycle. The third case involves Helena Volkov, a former schoolteacher from Ontario, Canada, who began experiencing spontaneous visions in 2015 after a severe head injury from a car accident. Unlike Sarah and Marcus, Helena did not seek out these experiences through hypnosis or meditation. They came unbidden, often during simple daily activities, striking her with the force of seizures, though neurologists found no evidence of epilepsy or brain damage beyond the initial injury. Helena's visions consistently focused on a specific civilization she believed existed on a now submerged landmass in the Atlantic Ocean. She described a society organized around massive crystal structures that served both spiritual and technological purposes, generating power through principles involving sound frequency and geometric resonance. Her descriptions were detailed enough that several fringe researchers became convinced she was accessing genuine memories of the legendary Atlantis. What makes Helena's case particularly relevant is her repeated encounters with the same phenomenon Marcus described, the blocking of certain information by entities she also called record keepers or guardians. Helena reported that during her visions, when she approached certain critical knowledge, particularly information about the technology used by this ancient civilization and the specific astronomical events that triggered its destruction, she would encounter a presence that would redirect her awareness elsewhere. She described it as similar to having a librarian firmly but gently guide you away from a restricted section, except this librarian existed within her own consciousness. Helena kept detailed journals of her experiences, and researchers studying her case noted unsettling patterns. She consistently reported that information about specific time periods was sealed or protected. The period around 12,000 years ago appeared particularly guarded. Any attempt to access detailed knowledge about the decades or centuries immediately preceding major cataclysmic events met with interference. And most disturbing, when she tried to access information about future timeline potentials, about whether similar catastrophes await our current civilization, she encountered the strongest resistance, sometimes resulting in severe headaches that lasted for days. The commonalities among these three cases and dozens of others documented by researchers form a disturbing pattern. First, the visions of advanced pre-flood civilizations appear across subjects with no connection to each other, no prior interest in ancient mysteries, and often no relevant education or background. The civilizations described consistently feature technological advancement beyond what mainstream archaeology attributes to ancient peoples, cities of monumental architecture aligned with astronomical precision and sophisticated understanding of mathematics, geometry, and natural forces. Second, the reports of cyclical cataclysms appear with remarkable consistency. Subjects describe catastrophic events involving rapid climate change, crustal displacement, massive flooding, and sky phenomena suggesting either asteroid impacts or other cosmic disturbances. The timelines mentioned cluster around specific dates, particularly a period roughly 12,000 years ago, corresponding intriguingly with the end of the last ice age and the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis that some scientists believe caused sudden global climate disruption. Third, and perhaps most unsettling, is the consistent report of entities blocking access to certain information within these records. Nearly everyone who claims to access the Akashic Records through any means reports encountering boundaries, guardians, or what researchers have termed information quarantine zones. Specific time periods appear sealed, Knowledge about the precise causes of ancient cataclysms seems deliberately obscured. Most protected of all appears to be information about cyclical patterns and future timeline potentials. This raises profound and disturbing questions. If we accept even the possibility that these individuals are accessing some form of collective memory or cosmic database, why would certain information be protected? Who or what determines which knowledge remains accessible and which gets sealed away? Are the record keepers protective entities preventing humanity from accessing dangerous knowledge before we are ready? Or are they something else entirely, serving purposes we cannot begin to understand? Some researchers suggest the blocked information relates to knowledge that could trigger mass panic or social collapse if widely known. If cyclical cataclysms are genuinely predictable and inevitable, if our civilization exists merely in the calm period between global catastrophes, would that knowledge benefit or destroy us? Would we use it to prepare and preserve our species? Or would society fracture under the weight of inevitable doom? Others propose that the protected knowledge involves technological or spiritual practices that ancient civilizations used, information that in the wrong hands could prove catastrophic. Perhaps the ancients possessed abilities or technologies whose misuse contributed to their own destruction, and the record keepers function as cosmic safety mechanisms, preventing us from repeating those mistakes. The pattern of blocked timelines suggests something even stranger. Why would the period around 12,000 years ago be so heavily protected? What happened then that requires such vigorous guarding? Mainstream archaeology acknowledges this period saw dramatic changes: the end of the Ice Age, the extinction of megafauna, the mysterious disappearance of Clovis culture in North America, and the beginning of agriculture and civilization in the Fertile Crescent. But the people accessing Akashic Records consistently report that something more significant occurred, something that contemporary academia has missed entirely or chosen to ignore. The testimonies speak of an advanced global civilization that achieved heights we are only now beginning to match, then vanished almost completely in the span of days or weeks due to catastrophic events whose causes remain deliberately obscured. They speak of survivors scattering across the globe, their descendants forgetting or mythologizing what came before, knowledge preserved only in fragments, in mystery school traditions, in cryptic monuments, and underground chambers. Most disturbing is the recurring warning, the sense that these catastrophes operate in cycles governed by astronomical forces beyond human control. That approximately every 12,000 years, something happens, cosmic mechanics click into alignment, and the Earth undergoes transformation that erases or fundamentally alters whatever civilization exists at that time. And by this reckoning, we are approaching the end of our cycle. Whether these accounts represent genuine access to some form of cosmic memory, elaborate psychological phenomena, or something else entirely remains hotly debated. But the consistency of the testimonies, the specific details that align across subjects with no contact with each other, and the archaeological anomalies that increasingly suggest advanced ancient cultures existed before currently accepted timelines, all point toward mysteries that deserve serious investigation rather than dismissive skepticism. The record keepers, if they exist, maintain their vigil, guarding whatever secrets lie sealed within those forbidden timelines, protecting or preventing humanity from accessing knowledge that might save us or destroy us. And those who touch those boundaries come away changed, carrying fragments of memories that might belong to civilizations dust for 12,000 years, and warnings about cycles that may be preparing to turn once more. In the darkest corners of esoteric literature, there exist accounts of civilizations so ancient and so profoundly disturbing that the very records of their existence appear corrupted, as if reality itself has tried to forget them. These are not the comfortable myths of ancient Egypt or Rome. These are testimonies from dozens of psychics, mystics, and clairvoyants who claim to have accessed the Akashic Records, that supposed cosmic library where every event in history is eternally preserved. And what they describe should terrify anyone who takes the time to examine the impossible consistency of their vision. The phenomenon begins with an unsettling observation. Starting in the late 1800s and continuing through the 20th century, individuals scattered across different continents, speaking different languages, with no contact between them, began reporting remarkably similar visions of lost civilizations. These were not vague impressions of ancient temples or forgotten cities. They were detailed, technical descriptions of societies possessing technologies that rivaled or exceeded our own, civilizations that rose to unimaginable heights before being utterly annihilated in catastrophes so complete that mainstream archaeology cannot find definitive proof they ever existed. The most famous of these lost lands is Lemuria, sometimes called Ma.Shao. According to multiple independent sources who claimed access to the Akashic Records, Lemuria existed millions of years before recorded history, spanning much of what is now the Pacific Ocean. The Theosophist William Scott Elliott published detailed descriptions in 1896 of Lemurian civilization, describing beings that were physically different from modern humans, towering in height with drastically different skeletal structures. But here is where the accounts become deeply unsettling. Scott Elliott never met Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, yet his descriptions of Lemurian technology matched hers with eerie precision. Both described massive cities built from a crystalline material that could be mentally controlled to change shape and transparency. Both described flying vehicles powered by a force that sounds disturbingly similar to what we might call anti-gravity technology. Both described the same catastrophic end, a destruction so violent that entire continents sank beneath the waves in a matter of hours. Then came the accounts of Mu from James Churchward, a British colonel who claimed in the 1920s to have translated ancient tablets in India. He had no connection to the Theosophical Society, no known contact with Blavatsky or Scott Elliott, yet his descriptions aligned with theirs in ways that seemed to defy coincidence. He described the same Pacific civilization. He described the same advanced knowledge of energy manipulation. He described the same sudden, catastrophic destruction. Three separate sources, no contact between them, describing the same impossible history. But Lemuria was apparently only the beginning. According to those who claim to read the Akashic Records, Lemuria was followed by Atlantis, the civilization that at least has some echo in mainstream historical texts through Plato's writings. And this is where the accounts take on a quality of genuine horror. Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian philosopher and esotericist, delivered a series of lectures between 1904 and 1924, detailing what he claimed to have seen in the Akashic Records about Atlantean civilization. Steiner's reputation makes his claims particularly disturbing because he was not a fringe figure. He founded the Waldorf School movement, developed biodynamic agriculture, and influenced fields ranging from architecture to medicine. This was not a charlatan seeking attention. This was a respected intellectual describing visions that clearly horrified him. Steiner claimed that Atlantean civilization had mastered what he called the life force, an energy that permeates all living things. According to his readings, Atlantean priests and magicians learned to manipulate this force directly, bending it to their will. They could accelerate plant growth to produce harvests in days instead of months. They could heal injuries that would normally be fatal. They could extend their own lifespans far beyond normal human limits. But then they discovered something darker. They learned that this life force could be extracted from living beings and concentrated, amplified, weaponized. Steiner described Atlantean black magicians who bred humans and animals specifically to harvest their life energy, draining them to fuel magical workings of terrible power. He described genetic experiments that created hybrid creatures, mixing human and animal characteristics in blasphemous combinations, designed to produce beings with greater reservoirs of life force to be exploited. The most disturbing aspect of Steiner's account is his description of how this technology corrupted Atlantean society from within. He claimed the ability to manipulate life energy created a caste system more rigid and cruel than anything in recorded history. Those with the knowledge and ability to channel life force became a ruling elite that viewed ordinary humans as nothing more than resources to be harvested. He described temples where thousands of slaves were kept in drug-induced states, their life energy slowly drained over years to power the magical workings of the priest class. He described weapons that could kill entire armies by extracting their life force instantaneously, leaving behind desiccated corpses that crumbled to dust. And then he described the end. According to Steiner, the manipulation of life force on such a massive scale created an instability in what he called the etheric field surrounding the earth. The Atlantean magicians, drunk on their own power, pushed further and further into forbidden territory, attempting to manipulate the very fabric of reality itself. They triggered something, a catastrophic release of energy that manifested as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tidal waves that destroyed their entire civilization in a series of cataclysms spanning several thousand years. The final destruction, Steiner claimed, came around 9600 BC, when the last remnants of Atlantis sank beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Now, here is what makes this deeply unsettling. Steiner delivered these lectures decades before the discovery of genetic engineering, before nuclear weapons, before we developed technologies that could genuinely threaten all life on Earth. Yet his descriptions of Atlantean society sound disturbingly like warnings about our own trajectory. The exploitation of life force mirrors our manipulation of genetic code. The energy weapons mirror our nuclear arsenals. The rigid caste system of those who control technology versus those who are controlled by it mirrors our own growing divides. But the truly chilling element emerges when we examine accounts from psychics who came after Steiner and claimed to have accessed even older records. Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet, gave hundreds of readings about Atlantis between the 1920s and 1940s. Cayce never met Steiner, was not educated in Steiner's anthroposophical philosophy, yet his descriptions of Atlantean technology align with Steiner's in fundamental ways. Cayce described what he called the terrible crystal, a massive device that focused solar energy and earth energy, providing power for the entire civilization. He described how this crystal was eventually weaponized, turned into a tool of destruction by corrupt priests who sought to eliminate their enemies. He described genetic experiments creating human-animal hybrids called things. He described a society that achieved material abundance beyond imagination, but descended into moral corruption that made that abundance meaningless. And like Steiner, Cayce described the same pattern of destruction. The misuse of the terrible crystal created instabilities that led to the destruction of Atlantis in 3 separate cataclysms. The first around 50,000 BC, the second around 15,600 BC, the final destruction around 9600 BC. That final date, matching Steiner's, coming from a man who had no apparent knowledge of Steiner's work. Multiple sources, no contact, describing the same timeline of destruction. But several sources claim there was something before even Lemuria. They speak of it carefully, with obvious reluctance, as if the very act of accessing these records is dangerous. They describe a civilization that existed so far back in time that the number of years becomes almost meaningless, somewhere between 5 and 18 million years ago. The few who claim to have accessed these records say they are fragmented, corrupted, as if something has actively tried to erase them from the Akashic database itself. What fragments remain describe a civilization that makes Atlantis look primitive by comparison. Technologies that could manipulate matter at the quantum level. The ability to transfer consciousness between bodies, achieving a kind of immortality. Mastery over space and time itself, allowing travel between dimensions. And they describe an evil so profound that the accounts become incoherent, as if the human mind cannot fully process what these beings did. References to experiments that violated the fundamental laws of reality. Attempts to reshape the fabric of existence itself according to their will. The creation of artificial intelligences that achieved consciousness but lacked any moral framework, entities of pure intellect without compassion or restraint. And then, a destruction so complete that it apparently erased most traces of this civilization from the Akashic Records themselves, something that should be theoretically impossible if these records truly contain everything that has ever happened. Multiple psychics who claim to have touched these ancient records report the same psychological aftermath, nightmares, a sense of having contacted something that damaged them spiritually, a feeling that some knowledge is genuinely forbidden because human consciousness is not equipped to process it without being corrupted. They speak of warnings embedded in the records, messages left by survivors or perhaps by whatever force destroyed this civilization. Warnings that certain paths of development lead inevitably to obliteration, that there are boundaries built into the structure of reality itself, and crossing them invokes consequences that are automatic and total. This brings us to the most disturbing question underlying all these accounts. Were these civilizations simply destroyed by natural consequences of their own actions, or was their destruction deliberate? Multiple sources describe the cataclysms that ended these societies using language that suggests intentionality. They speak of the Earth itself rejecting what these civilizations had become, of cosmic forces intervening to prevent them from spreading their corruption beyond this planet, of a kind of immune response built into reality, triggering when conscious beings violate fundamental laws. Rudolf Steiner claimed that the Atlantean catastrophe was karmic necessity, that the level of corruption achieved by Atlantean black magicians created such an imbalance that cosmic justice demanded their elimination. Edgar Cayce spoke of the destructions as warnings, suggesting that remnants of these civilizations were deliberately preserved in the collective unconscious of humanity, so that we would have the knowledge to avoid repeating their mistakes. Other sources go further, suggesting these destructions were punishment enacted by higher dimensional beings, cosmic guardians, who intervene when a species threatens to become a cancer that could spread beyond its homeworld. And all of them, every source that claims to have accessed these records, delivers the same final warning. They say our current civilization is following the same pattern, the same obsession with technology without wisdom, the same pursuit of power without ethics, the same growing divide between those who control advanced knowledge and those who are subject to it. They point to our genetic engineering, our artificial intelligence research, our weapons of mass destruction, our environmental devastation, and they say this is how it begins. This is the early stage of the pattern that has played out before, multiple times, always ending in the same way. Some sources claim the Akashic Records contain not just the past but probability fields for the future, branching timelines showing possible outcomes based on collective human choices. And they say that in the vast majority of these probable futures, our civilization ends in catastrophe within the next few centuries, some through nuclear war, some through environmental collapse, some through the creation of artificial intelligence that decides humanity is obsolete. The specifics vary, but the outcome remains consistent: another advanced civilization destroying itself, leaving behind only scattered ruins and legends for whatever survives to puzzle over. The question that haunts those who study these accounts is simple but profound. If all of this is true, if the Akashic Records genuinely contain evidence of multiple advanced civilizations destroying themselves, why has this knowledge not changed our behavior? The answer, suggested by several sources, is even more disturbing. They claim that part of the pattern is that each civilization, as it approaches the critical threshold, loses the ability to recognize the danger. Cognitive biases become so entrenched, institutional momentum becomes so powerful, that course correction becomes effectively impossible. The warnings are available, the knowledge is there, but the civilization is psychologically incapable of acting on it. Like an addict who knows the drug will kill them but cannot stop using it, we continue accelerating toward the same cliff that claimed our predecessors. Were these lost civilizations destroyed as punishment for specific transgressions? Or were they simply consumed by the inevitable consequences of their own choices? The accounts from the Akashic Records suggest both answers might be correct, that there are natural consequences built into the fabric of reality, and those consequences are so severe and so certain that they function as punishment, even if no conscious entity is enacting judgment. Cross certain boundaries, violate certain fundamental principles, and destruction follows as surely as night follows day. Not because an angry god strikes you down, but because you have triggered mechanisms built into the deep structure of existence itself, fail-safes designed to prevent conscious beings from acquiring power they are not wise enough to wield. And if that is true, then the most terrifying question is not what these ancient civilizations did to warrant their destruction. The most terrifying question is whether we are already past the point of no return, whether our civilization has already crossed the threshold that makes catastrophe inevitable, and we are simply living in the brief window before the consequences manifest. The Akashic Records, according to those who claim to read them, suggest that this question remains open, that the outcome is not yet fixed, but the window for changing course is closing rapidly. The warnings are clear. The pattern is established. The choice apparently is still ours. But for how much longer? Atlantis. The human mind, as it turns out, was never designed to hold the weight of eternity. Those who venture into the Akashic Records often forget this fundamental truth until it is far too late. until the knowledge they've sought begins to unravel the very fabric of their consciousness like thread pulled from an ancient tapestry. In the autumn of 2003, Dr. Helena Varga, a clinical psychologist and practicing medium based in Budapest, underwent what her colleagues would later describe as a complete psychological disintegration. For 15 years, she had maintained a respected practice, helping clients connect with deceased loved ones, her accuracy documented and verified by multiple researchers interested in paranormal phenomena. She was known for her methodical approach, her skeptical questioning of her own experiences, her insistence on maintaining rigorous personal boundaries when accessing what she called the deeper realms of consciousness. On the evening of October 23rd, Helena told her assistant that she intended to attempt something she had been preparing for across 3 years of meditation and spiritual practice. She wanted to access the Akashic Records directly, to move beyond the fragmented impressions she typically received and to read from the source itself. Her assistant, Maria Kovacs, later testified that Helena seemed calm, even excited, as she entered her private consultation room that night. 4 hours later, Maria heard screaming. She found Helena curled in the corner of the room, her hands pressed against her temples, tears streaming down her face. The words Helena spoke made no sense at the time. She repeated phrases in languages Maria didn't recognize, interspersed with desperate pleading in Hungarian. "Please," she kept saying. "Please, I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know." When paramedics arrived, Helena had fallen silent. She was conscious, her eyes open, but she no longer responded to her name or to any external stimuli. In the hospital, neurologists found nothing physically wrong with her brain. No stroke, no tumor, no explainable medical cause for her condition. But Helena Varga never practiced as a medium again. More disturbing still, she never spoke again about what she had witnessed during those 4 hours. In the years that followed, Helena would occasionally emerge from her withdrawn state long enough to write fragmentary notes. Her sister, who became her primary caretaker, shared some of these writings with researchers. One note, written in shaking handwriting, read simply, "The future is a wound that bleeds backward." Another said, "We are the children of a mistake, and they know it." When pressed by doctors, by family, by former colleagues who begged her to explain what had happened, Helena would shake her head violently and retreat further into silence. By 2009, she had descended into what psychiatrists classified as catatonic depression, though her sister insisted it was something else entirely. "She's not depressed," her sister told investigators. "She's hiding. She's trying to make herself invisible to something that saw her looking." Helena's case might be dismissed as a singular tragedy, a psychological breakdown triggered by the intense pressure of her practice, if not for the pattern. Across the world, other practitioners who claim to have accessed the Akashic Records report strikingly similar experiences. The similarities in their accounts are difficult to ignore, even for skeptics. In Los Angeles, a psychic named Marcus Webb described his experience accessing the records in 2007. He had been practicing for over 20 years, was well known in spiritual communities, led workshops on meditation and psychic development. After what he described as a successful deep session, accessing the records, Marcus returned to ordinary consciousness and immediately checked himself into a psychiatric facility. In interviews conducted later, after months of therapy, he described what he had encountered not as a library or a database, but as an aware presence, something that watched him as he attempted to read. Marcus claimed that as he moved through what he perceived as vast corridors of information, certain areas felt different. While most of the records appeared neutral, almost translucent in his perception, some sections were dark, completely opaque, sealed off as if intentionally hidden. When he attempted to access information about a specific date in the future, a date he refused to name publicly, he said the darkness opened up, and something looked back at him. Not metaphorically, he insisted in his testimony. Something intelligent, something that existed within the records themselves, turned its attention toward him, and in that moment of recognition, he understood that human consciousness was not equipped to withstand direct contact with that intelligence. Marcus described the experience as similar to a small fish suddenly realizing it is swimming in the open ocean, and that beneath it, rising from unimaginable depths, is something vast and ancient and hungry. He left the facility after 8 months, abandoned his practice entirely, and now works as a carpenter in Oregon. He has stated publicly that he will never attempt to access the records again, that the price of that knowledge is too high for any human mind to pay. The concept of guardian entities within the Akashic Records appears across multiple independent accounts. These are not the benevolent spiritual guides that popular literature often describes, but something far more disturbing. Practitioners describe them as presences that actively patrol certain sections of the records, particularly areas dealing with specific historical periods and future events. A collective account emerged in 2011 when 7 psychics from different countries, none of whom had previous contact with one another, participated in a research study conducted by the Institute for Noetic Sciences. Each was asked to attempt to access the Akashic Records and report specifically on human history during what archaeologists call the missing millennia, the gaps in human civilization between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago. All 7 practitioners independently reported encountering what they described as walls, barriers, or in some cases, entities that prevented access to this information. 3 of the 7 experienced severe psychological distress following the experiment. 1. A woman named Sarah Chen from Vancouver described feeling as if her consciousness had been physically pushed out of the records, expelled with such force that she experienced vertigo and nausea for days afterward. Another practitioner, David Kowalski from Manchester, reported that when he attempted to push past the barrier, he felt what he could only describe as a warning, a communication that was not in words but in pure emotion. The message was clear. This information is sealed for your protection, and to continue is to invite consequences that cannot be undone. The 4th practitioner, who experienced distress, refused to participate in follow-up interviews and withdrew from the study completely. According to researchers, he sent a single email before cutting off all contact. Some doors are locked from the inside for a reason. I saw what's behind one of them, and I can never unsee it. I won't help you open these doors for others. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports of sealed future dates. Multiple practitioners, working independently and in different years, have reported that when attempting to access information about specific points in humanity's future, they encounter absolute voids, black spaces in the records where information should exist, but appears to have been deliberately removed or hidden. These are not simply blank areas or gaps in knowledge, but active absences, places where the records seem to refuse access with an almost aggressive determination. In 2015, a British medium named Catherine Ashworth published an account of her attempt to view the year 2043. Catherine had been practicing for 30 years and had previously published several books on her experiences with psychic phenomena. She described approaching this future date in the records and finding what she called a wall of static, a barrier that seemed to pulse with its own energy. When she attempted to push her consciousness through this barrier, she experienced what can only be described as psychic feedback. She felt pain, actual physical pain in her body, and heard what sounded like thousands of voices screaming in unison. Catherine woke in her meditation room hours later with no memory of how the session had ended. In the weeks that followed, she began experiencing vivid nightmares, all featuring the same theme: human figures standing in empty cities, looking up at a sky that was somehow wrong, somehow corrupted. She sought help from other practitioners, many of whom confirmed they had experienced similar barriers when attempting to access certain future dates. One colleague told her that she had concluded the sealed dates represented extinction events, moments when human consciousness collectively ceased, and that the records, being essentially human in nature, could show nothing beyond that point because nothing existed to record. But others proposed something far more unsettling. They suggested that the dates are sealed, not because nothing happens, but because what happens is so catastrophic, so fundamentally reality-altering, that knowledge of it would break human consciousness in the present. The theory goes that the records themselves, or whatever intelligence governs them, has determined that certain information must remain hidden because the human mind, confronting such knowledge, would simply stop functioning. It would be equivalent to trying to run software on hardware that was never designed to process it. The system would crash. This brings us to the most chilling theory that has emerged from these collective experiences, that the Akashic Records are not passive storage at all, but a living consciousness, a vast intelligence that actively curates what can be known and by whom. Some practitioners have gone further, suggesting that accessing the records is not like reading a book in a library, but like being observed by the library itself, which makes decisions about what to reveal based on criteria we cannot understand. Dr. Thomas Ashford, a psychiatrist who has studied cases of breakdown among psychics and mediums, has documented 43 cases since 2005 of practitioners who experienced severe psychological distress after attempting to access the Akashic Records. In his analysis, he notes patterns that suggest these individuals may have encountered something genuinely anomalous. The consistency of their reports, the specific nature of their symptoms, and the timing of their breakdowns all point to experiences that transcend simple delusion or stress-induced psychosis. Most troubling are the cases where practitioners claim the records began accessing them. Instead of simply viewing information, they report that information began flowing into their consciousness unbidden, overwhelming them with data they did not seek and could not process. One woman, whose name has been withheld for privacy, described it as drowning in knowledge, feeling her sense of self being dissolved by the sheer volume of information pouring into her mind. She claimed that in those moments, she understood that the records are not meant for individual human consciousness, that we are too small, too limited, too briefly alive to hold more than fragments of what exists in that vast repository. She survived her experience but described what remained of her identity as a shadow, a remnant of who she had been before she learned what the records actually are. In her final interview before withdrawing from public life, she said something that other practitioners have echoed: "The records are not human. They may contain human history, human futures, human possibilities, but they are not of us. They are older, vaster, and they are aware. And once they notice you, once they truly see you looking back at them, you are marked. You carry that attention with you, and it changes you in ways you can never undo." The question that haunts researchers who study these cases is whether these breakdowns represent encounters with genuine cosmic intelligence, or whether they are elaborate psychological constructions, the mind creating monsters from its own depth. But those who have spoken with survivors, who have seen the terror that persists in their eyes years after their experiences, find it difficult to dismiss their accounts entirely. There is a quality to their fear that seems to transcend ordinary trauma, a suggestion that they have brushed against something that human consciousness was never meant to touch, and that in that brief contact, they were fundamentally and irreversibly changed. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these accounts is not what they claim exists in the Akashic Records, but what they suggest about the nature of knowledge itself. That there are things which, once known, cannot be unknown, and that the knowing of them extracts a price measured not in years or pain, but in the dissolution of the self that sought to know in the first place. Throughout this exploration of the Akashic Records, we've encountered something that refuses to fit neatly into either the box marked "explained" or the one marked "imagination." We've traced accounts across centuries and continents, examined testimonies from people who never knew of each other's existence, and found ourselves facing a pattern that shouldn't exist if this were merely myth or coincidence. The question that haunts researchers isn't whether people believe they've accessed something. It's why their descriptions align with such disturbing precision. Consider the impossibility at the heart of this phenomenon. A mystic in 19th century Russia describes entering a vast hall of crystalline light where knowledge exists as living symbols. Decades later, an American medium with no knowledge of European esoteric traditions describes the same crystalline structures, the same sensation of information flowing directly into consciousness without words. Travel further back, and ancient Hindu texts detail the Akasha in terms that mirror these modern testimonies with eerie accuracy. Move across the globe to indigenous traditions in Australia and South America, and you find similar concepts of a cosmic memory accessible through altered states of consciousness. The skeptical explanation would be cultural transmission, some hidden thread connecting these accounts through shared human mythology. But that explanation fractures when you examine the specifics. These aren't vague similarities. People describe the same organizational structure, the same sense of information being stored as vibrating energy rather than written text, the same overwhelming awareness of being surrounded by infinite knowledge. They report identical sensations of time becoming meaningless, of perceiving past and future as equally present and accessible. The details match in ways that casual cultural borrowing cannot explain. Then there are the cases that push beyond pattern recognition into genuinely disturbing territory. The documented instances where individuals obtained information they could not possibly have known. The psychic who described in detail a historical event that mainstream historians didn't verify until archaeological evidence emerged years later. The regression therapist whose patient recalled specific details about an ancient civilization that matched findings from excavations on the opposite side of the world. The businessman who claimed to access technical information from the records that led to patents in cutting-edge technology. What do we do with these cases? They sit in the files of researchers who cannot publish them for fear of professional ridicule, yet cannot dismiss them as fraud when the verifiable information checks out. These aren't vague predictions or cold reading tricks. These are instances of specific, confirmable knowledge appearing where it shouldn't exist. And here's where the mystery deepens into something more unsettling. If we entertain the possibility that the Akashic Records are real in some form, that there exists some repository of cosmic information accessible under certain conditions, we must then ask the questions that follow. Who maintains such a library? What intelligence or force organizes and preserves this information across all of time and space? The traditions speak of cosmic librarians, of keeper entities that guard the records, but they offer no satisfying explanation of their nature or origin. Consider the implications if consciousness somehow imprints itself on the fabric of reality, if every thought and action leaves an energetic trace that persists. Such a mechanism would require laws of physics we haven't discovered, dimensions of existence our instruments cannot measure. It would mean the universe itself is far stranger than our current scientific models allow. And that possibility, that we live in a cosmos fundamentally different from what we assume, carries its own brand of existential dread. More disturbing still are the consistent reports of sealed sections within the records, areas that resist access even by experienced practitioners. Multiple psychics across different traditions mention approaching certain information and encountering what they describe as barriers, as if some knowledge is deliberately protected or hidden. Some report the sensation of being gently but firmly redirected when attempting to access specific time periods or future events. Others describe a more forceful rejection, a psychic equivalent of being physically pushed away from certain areas of the cosmic library. What knowledge would require such protection? What could be so dangerous or destabilizing that it needs to be shielded from human consciousness? The mystics who've encountered these barriers speak of them with something approaching fear. They describe the overwhelming sense that some information is sealed for good reason, that certain truths about reality or our future would shatter something fundamental in the human psyche if accessed prematurely. There are whispers in esoteric circles of time periods that appear deliberately obscured within the records, eras of human history where the information seems corrupted or inaccessible. Some researchers point to specific millennia in our past where the historical record grows mysteriously thin, where archaeological evidence suggests advanced civilizations that mainstream history cannot account for. Could these gaps in our understanding correspond to sealed sections within the Akashic Records? And if so, what happened during those lost ages that requires such thorough concealment? Perhaps most chilling are the accounts from those who claim to have glimpsed fragments of sealed information, usually by accident or during particularly deep trance states. They speak of visions that left them psychologically scarred, of knowledge about the nature of human existence or the future of our species that they wish they could forget. Some have stopped practicing entirely after such experiences. Others continue but refuse to approach certain areas of inquiry ever again. Their reluctance speaks volumes about what they might have encountered. The phenomenon raises questions that strike at the foundation of how we understand reality. If the Akashic Records exist and contain information about future events, does that mean our futures are predetermined, already written, and waiting to be read? The mystics who explore these realms insist it's more complex than simple predetermination, that what they perceive are probabilities and potential timelines rather than fixed certainties. But even that explanation offers little comfort. It suggests a cosmos where the boundaries between past, present, and future are far more permeable than we assume, where causality itself might be stranger than our linear thinking allows. And what of the reports that the records contain knowledge of coming catastrophes, of global events that will reshape human civilization? Throughout history, prophets and seers have claimed to read warnings in the cosmic library to see the potential futures unfolding before us. Some of their visions have proven disturbingly accurate. Others remain unfulfilled, either because they were wrong or because the future they perceived was altered by human action. We cannot know which, but the consistency of catastrophic visions across cultures and centuries forms its own disturbing pattern. Why would such a repository be accessible at all? If dangerous knowledge exists within the records, if there are sections deliberately sealed away, why allow any human access? The traditional explanation is that consciousness evolution requires access to higher knowledge, that spiritual growth depends on gradually expanding our awareness of cosmic truth. But that explanation assumes benevolence, assumes the records exist for our benefit. What if their purpose is something else entirely? What if we're not meant to be reading them at all, and those who access the records are trespassing on something that was never intended for human consciousness? The most unsettling possibility is that the Akashic Records are real, that they function exactly as described by centuries of mystics and psychics, and that we lack the framework to understand what they truly are. Perhaps they're not a library at all, but something our human minds interpret as one, because that's the only way we can process what we're encountering. Perhaps consciousness itself leaves traces in dimensions we cannot measure, and what sensitives perceive as the records is actually the imprint of all thought and experience on the fabric of reality itself. If that's true, then everyone who's ever lived has left their mark there, contributed to this cosmic memory. Every secret, every hidden crime, every private moment of joy or despair, preserved forever in a dimension beyond physical space. The implications for privacy, for the illusion of individual autonomy we hold so dear, are profound and deeply disturbing. Nothing would truly be private. Nothing would be forgotten. We're left with questions that have no satisfying answers, only more questions spiraling outward into mystery. The Akashic Records stand at the intersection of science and spirituality, consciousness and cosmos, knowledge and madness. They represent either humanity's greatest source of hidden wisdom or our most persistent and elaborate delusion. Perhaps they're both simultaneously, which might be the most disturbing possibility of all. And so we arrive at the thought that keeps researchers awake in the quiet hours, the possibility that whispers at the edge of understanding. Maybe the knowledge locked in those sealed sections is protected for good reason. Maybe the catastrophes written in future timelines are events we're better off not knowing about in advance. Maybe there's a cosmic mercy in forgetting certain things our souls knew before birth, in not remembering everything our consciousness has experienced across lifetime. Maybe the barriers and restrictions, the sealed sections and redirected inquiries, aren't limitations at all but protections. Maybe we're being shielded from knowledge that would break us, from truths about reality that human consciousness isn't evolved enough to process without shattering. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest wisdom isn't in accessing the cosmic library, but in accepting that some books are meant to remain closed, some knowledge is meant to stay hidden, and some futures are better left unread until they arrive. The Akashic Records remain, as they always have, just beyond the edge of proven reality, waiting in whatever dimension consciousness touches when it expands beyond the everyday. And perhaps that's exactly where they should stay. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.